Alexander, who's joined us tonight. He's been doing lots of fantastic work at the Treasury of Lives for about 15 years already, this website, which is a precious resource to all people interested in the Himalayas. Alexander is a specialist on Eastern Tibet, 19th century Kham, and he's written a fantastic book he can tell us more about, as well as several scholarly articles about the region. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us tonight, Alexander. And I'll let you get on to it now. And if anybody has questions, you can please write them in the chat. The talk will go on for about an hour, after which Alexander will kindly take questions for up to 30 minutes, depending on us. So welcome, everybody. Welcome, Alexander. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Jamyang. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Jamyang, for inviting me to give this talk. I'm appreciating people's willingness these days to Zoom into meetings and talks. It's been a difficult year for everyone. So I'm talking to you from the Delaware River Valley in New York State, about 2 hours from New York City. And I know it looks like I'm in a tent, but this is the ceiling of my attic. I'm in an old farmhouse. So as Jamyang said, I'm the director of the Treasury of Lives, which I created about 11 years ago. If you don't know it, it's a biographical encyclopedia of the Tibetan cultural sphere. The main focus is religion, but we have a fair amount of politicians and folks who engaged in various other occupations. Like any encyclopedia, it's a collaborative effort. We're up to about 120 authors with well over 1,200 biographies. As you mentioned, I'm also the author of a biography of a famous Tibetan Lama called Jamgon Kongtrul, a 19th century genius who, with a few close collaborators, organized the many traditions of Tibetan Buddhism into what we have today. He was a ritual master and a collector of texts and an incredibly inquisitive man, bent on acquiring all that was available at the time for formulating it to be passed forward. I'll be drawing on a few examples from his life to talk about the many ways in which lamas develop their authority in Tibet. Speaking about the Treasury of Lives, a few months ago, we posted a long biography of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. So outside of the very devotional full-length biographies that have been published, it's probably the first comprehensive biography of Trungpa to date. Certainly the first that addresses the dark side of his legacy. It was not an easy biography to write. Trungpa was a brilliant teacher, but he was a deeply flawed human being. And the organization he built has caused as much pain as it has brought benefit. And I know that's difficult to say. A lot of Trungpa's actions, which today are easily recognized as abuses of authority, are well documented, in part because Trungpa made no secret of any of them. He held public ceremonies, for example, in which he wedded the multiple students he was sleeping with, and even putting some of them on the board of Shambhala. A reader wrote very quickly to complain that in relating these accounts, I must have an agenda, that by repeating these well-documented events and activities of Trungpa, I was insulting or attacking his Lama. Thinking about it, obviously I'm an editor and I'm a writer and I don't want to admit that I have an agenda, but I realized I do have an agenda, and that's to portray Tibetan Lamas as human beings, not insult or demean them. I would never want to be disrespectful, even to a teacher who's been accused of abuse, but neither would I want to pretend that abuse is impossible. I have met many lamas and developed great faith in many of them. I see them as remarkable human beings, but in my practice, I've cultivated a perception in which they are perfect, enlightened beings. But that doesn't mean they're not still human beings. And every human being is capable of harming others. And I think if we forget that, we forget our lama's humanity and we lose a vital connection to them. So I'm going to talk today about lamas. I'm going to talk about some of the Buddhist doctrine that set up the lama as the replacement for the Buddha, and various rituals and cultural institutions that generate and maintain a lama's authority, such as the empowerment ritual, guru yoga, lineage, and hagiographies. I want to acknowledge that I'll probably be using the pronoun he a lot. And the fact is that traditionally most Buddhist teachers have been and continue to be men. This is fortunately changing with more and more female lamas, and I will try to remain as gender neutral as possible. I'm going to start super general and then get into a few examples of the lives of Jamgon Kongtrul and his collaborators. And I guess in terms of a main point, I want to talk about where a lama's authority comes from, how a lama acquires it, and how we as disciples engage with it. To start, there's no real good explanation of the word Lama. It's used as a translation in Tibet for the Indian term guru, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but it's a made-up word that has no clear etymology. La can mean exalted, and ma is either a negation or a term for mother. So it's sort of assumed it means something like nothing higher or high mother. But the symbol la is also the same word that means one's life force in relation to the place or object with which one shares a sympathetic connection. In pre-Buddhist Tibet, people appear to have believed that their life force was tethered to a lake or a cliff or a mountain, and could even wander off and get lost, requiring rituals to call it back. So the Lama has a sense of exaltedness, of the caring attention of a parent, and of one's very life essence embodied in the world. This is unique in Tibetan Buddhism, a native development of an inherited Indian Tantric Buddhism. You find teachers in other Buddhist traditions, even gurus, but not lamas the way the Tibetans have them. So I'm going to start with a broad sketch of some doctrine from early Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and Tantric Buddhism to sort of contextualize the Lama. Early Buddhism, I use that term to refer to the Buddhism that was based on the Pali scriptures and represented today by the Theravadan traditions of Southeast Asia. As you know, people used to say Hinayana, which we don't anymore because it means base vehicle and is an insult. The closest thing to a guru in early Buddhism was the monastic preceptor, the man who ordained a new monk. Otherwise, the Buddha strongly cautioned against elevating any individual as his replacement. In life, no one was equal to the Buddha, and in death, no one was to take his place. One way in which he warned against this was by preaching a doctrine of be an island unto yourself. This is found, among other places, in the Chakravarti Sinhananda Sutta, the lion's roar of the turning of the wheel. It opens with, "Thus have I heard. Once the Lord was staying among the Magadhans at Matula. Then he said, 'Monks.' 'Lord,' they replied. And the Lord said, 'Monks, be an island unto yourselves. Be a refuge unto yourselves, with no other refuge. And how does a monk dwell on an island unto himself, as a refuge unto himself, with no other refuge, with Dhamma as his island, with the Dhamma as his refuge, with no other monks, with no other refuge? Here, a monk abides contemplating body as body, ardent, clearly aware and mindful, having put aside hankering and fretting for the world. He abides contemplating feelings as feelings, mind as mind objects as mind objects, ardent, clearly aware and mindful, having put aside hankering and fretting for the world." So please don't think of this as a call to be independent or to overlook the fundamental truth of dependent arising. Note that the Dhamma is to be the island and the refuge. Be an island unto yourself doesn't mean forge your own path or disregard your neighbor. It doesn't literally mean be isolated from others. It seems to have meant that once the Buddha himself passed away, Buddhists should not follow another teacher. They should take the Buddha as the model, the Dhamma as the guiding teaching, and the Sangha as the community of support. One has to examine the truth of reality for oneself, using the three jewels as guides and supports. There are all sorts of hierarchies within the Sangha, of course, and novice monks rely on senior monks for instruction, but no particular monk should be elevated to the status comparable to the Buddha. Early Buddhism drew a clear distinction between a Buddha and an enlightened disciple. His disciples were not liberated as Buddhas, but as arhats, which means worthy one, or in Tibetan translation, drajomba, foe destroyer, the foe being the afflictions that tether one to samsara. Doctrine had it that there could only be one Buddha in the world at a time, and only when that Buddha's teaching vanished could another Bodhisattva, Maitreya is the current Buddha in waiting, be born in India to become a Buddha and teach a new iteration of the Dharma. Both Buddhas and Arhats are fully liberated from samsara, but a Buddha's enlightenment is better. It is more complete because it is obtained without relying on a teacher. A Buddha figures out the truth for himself and then goes on to teach others. An Arhat isn't qualified to take the role of the teacher. That would mean he was a Buddha. So all he or she can do is repeat the Buddha's teachings. This rule about one Buddha at a time was probably made in order to preserve the focus on Shakyamuni Buddha's teachings. There were many charismatic religious teachers in India in the Buddha's era. It's no good if the community starts fracturing around other reputedly enlightened beings. The point is, notice how serious the early Buddhist community took this notion of not replacing the Buddha with a different elevated individual. There's no question that early Buddhist communities did venerate the memory of the Buddha. They created reliquaries or stupas to contain relics and to serve as community focal points for ritual activities. Scholars theorize that early worship of the relics of the Buddha gave rise to Mahayana notions of the ever-present and eternal Buddha, which is represented both in the universal truth of emptiness, or the Dharmakaya, and by extension, the theory of the essential enlightened nature of every sentient being, our Buddha nature, or Tathagata Garbha. Mahayana Buddhism, as you know, developed in part around the figure of the Bodhisattva. In early Buddhism, the Bodhisattva was simply the previous lives of the Buddha. Before he was born as Siddhartha Gautama, he lived countless lives as a being who had taken a vow to become a Buddha to teach others how to get free from samsara. The Mahayana made this path of the Bodhisattva available to all who vowed to strive for enlightenment for the benefit of all, like a Buddha, rather than just for their own benefit, like an Arhat. It's worth noting that the historical record tells us that in Buddhist communities in India, monks who were on the Arhat path and monks who were on the Bodhisattva path lived together. There seems to have been no Mahayana monasteries distinct from other traditions. As a result of the expansion of the Bodhisattva path to those brave enough to undertake it, the notion of there only being one Buddha at a time was eventually abandoned. First, Bodhisattvas aspired to become Buddhas in other world systems, and then people seem to have become comfortable with the notion that anyone could become a Buddha at any time. Thus, in Tibetan Buddhism, we have figures like Padmasambhava, historically based people who are reputed to have been fully awakened Buddhas. The Bodhisattva path begins with the vow to attain full enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. The reason early Buddhism is deemed less than is because the faithful vow to get out of samsara as individuals, and the Arhats don't teach or bring anyone with them. It's not only a lesser goal, but it's also deemed by the Mahayana, at least, as impossible. If you think you exist as an individual, then you're by definition in samsara. You can't abandon the notion of I and then go on and say, I am going to be liberated. The very sentence is an expression of dualistic thinking, the ignorance that is one of the defining characteristics of samsaric existence. So in the early scriptures, the Bodhisattva vow was made in the presence of a Buddha. A man named Sumedha, who would become Sakyamuni Buddha, made his vow to the Buddha Dipamkara, who then gave him the prediction of his enlightenment after all those lifetimes as the Bodhisattva. In Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattvas are everywhere in the forms of lamas and historical saints and its deities such as Tara, Avalokiteshvara, Manjushri. These are beings worthy of worship because they're here to serve us. Remember that. Beings worthy of worship because they are far enough along the path, perhaps they've even completed it, such that they are qualified to teach others. They have a status that in early Buddhism was reserved solely for the Buddha. Where in early Buddhism, the goal was to escape samsara as an arhat, in Mahayana, it is to achieve, to bring all beings to enlightenment as a Buddha, which is a process that takes millions of lifetimes to achieve. In Tantric Buddhism, the goal is to attain enlightenment as a Buddha in this life, right now, using techniques that are radically effective. The possibility is based on basic Mahayana doctrine. If all of existence is by nature empty of self-nature, then there is no real distinction between samsara and nirvana. And if our fundamental nature is already enlightenment, if our mind is by nature pure, and samsara is only a delusion, a misunderstanding, a matter of mistaken perception, then we should be able to clear things up quite simply. Rather than spend millions of lifetimes purifying our mind and accumulating sufficient merit, why not just stop thinking we're not Buddhas? You find this notion beautifully expressed in Zen Buddhism. My favorite proverb is "Fang xia tu dao li di cheng fo." Put down your butcher's knife, become a Buddha right here. You know, this vision of this image that we're all like butchers stuck in pain and misery and harm causing with our knives. Throw them down, become a Buddha. Stop not being a Buddha. Tantra then is less a new doctrine than a set of ritual practices that are designed to correct our perception, including various antinomian or norm-busting activities like sitting on corpses or heavy drinking. One common metaphor in Tantra is using the powerful poisons of samsara as the fuel to liberate. The lotus is particularly beloved as a symbol because it emerges so beautifully out of mud. These practices are categorized as secret, as so powerful that only a select few could engage with them. Practitioners initially roamed about individually or in small groups, sort of crazy outsider mystics who might perform a ritual for you if you needed it, but were otherwise on the margins of society. Their texts were composed in cryptic, symbolic language, requiring explanation from those in the know. You can't pick up a tantra and expect to understand it. And Tibetan Buddhism is a very exciting marriage between monastic Buddhism and these fairly wild, seemingly uncontainable practices. And the Lama sits right in the center of all of it. All right, so any cultural institution has rituals to change an individual's status from outsider to insider. Naturalization ceremonies for citizens, which often have several levels of approach. To be a lawyer, you have to pass the bar. To be a monk, you have to ordain. To be a bodhisattva, you have to take a vow before a Buddha. To be a king, you have to be enthroned. These rituals literally change your identity and status. In tantric practice, an individual trains perception to see themselves as a Buddha in the center of a mandala. You can think of it as the interiorization of a ceremony of worship. In the basic Indian puja model, a devotee sets up an altar, consecrates it as a purified space in which the deity can reside. They then make prayers and call the deity to inhabit the image or object on the altar. Once there, the devotee makes offerings of food and drink and other substances, and in exchange asks for boons, a good harvest, a cure from illness, a clearer mind. They then ask the deity to depart and make prayers or vows to sort of seal it and close the event. Tantric Buddhism, it's all about using one's own body as the altar, as the image in which the Buddha is going to reside. It's important to understand these practices to recognize the difference between Indian and European notions of a holy image. In Europe, particularly after the Protestant Reformation, an image of God was regarded as a pure symbol. It was not God. In India, however, icon worship was and still is the norm. The image is made and consecrated so that the God can inhabit it. Rituals of opening the eyes, feeding the icon, waking it up, putting it to sleep, these all abound in South Asia and elsewhere. They are ways of expressing the physical presence of the God and for the faithful to come into direct contact. Catholics are maybe not unfamiliar with this. Think of the rituals of parading an icon through town once a year. And Tantric Buddhism employs this notion of the presence of the God during the ritual. In Buddhist worship, a consecrated statue of Manjushri is Manjushri and is treated accordingly. So in tantric practice, the altar is not there in the room, it's the devotee's own body. The deity is perceived as inhabiting the body, merging with the devotee's self. Once accomplished, the devotee is the center of the deity's mandala. The entire world becomes transformed into that Buddha's Pure Land. And just like images on an altar have to be consecrated through elaborate rituals to make the body suitable for the deity to inhabit, it must be purified through the empowerment ritual. This is known as abhisheka, wong in Tibetan. It's a rite in which a disciple is given the permission to engage in practice, and it is one of the defining characteristics of Tantra. The empowerment ritual works along the same lines as royal investiture. And in fact, historians believe that it was adapted from that rite. The devotee is anointed with certain substances, dressed in garlands and special robes, given a crown to wear, given a scepter to hold, given a new name, and so forth. The ritual makes an individual a pure vessel for the deity. It authorizes the person as the center of the mandala, suitable to receive offerings. And now finally, we're getting to the guru. A king does not enthrone himself. Priests or other court officials do it. So too with the tantric empowerment ritual. A guru has to perform the rite. Again, the abhisheka is quite literally a ritual that purifies the devotee's body, making it a suitable vessel for the deity to inhabit. Or another way of thinking about it, for one's inherent enlightened nature to manifest. Remember the vow a person would take before a Buddha to attain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings and thereby become a bodhisattva. The person with the authority to receive that vow and thereby make it real, to give it substance, had to be a Buddha. Same thing with the empowerment rite. The person giving it has to have the proper status. He or she has to be a Buddha. In the abhisheka, a person who has the authority to transform the devotee's body into a pure vessel for an enlightened being is the guru. For the rite to be valid, the guru has to have the status equal to that of a Buddha. Think of the empowerment ritual as the Buddha anointing a bodhisattva. So in Tantric Buddhism, the guru is the Buddha, or at the very least, a highly realized bodhisattva. The Lama has to be so in order to do their job, in order to perform the empowerment rite, and in order to teach the Dharma. For this reason, it's very common in Tibet to hear people say that the Lama is even more important than the Buddha. The Buddha's gone, but the Lama is here. The Lama is the person who is guiding us now. The Lama, in fact, is the Buddha incarnate. So if the Lama has to have the authority to perform the empowerment, and additionally to guide one to enlightenment, where does that authority come from? There are many ways in which that authority is established by, and by which it's maintained and increased. The empowerment ritual is one of these. Each time a Lama performs the empowerment, they're presenting themselves as a Buddha, and they're being perceived by their disciples as such. It enacts the ideal, it puts it into practice. This is how authority works. It is a mutually agreed upon status. Everyone has to be in on it for it to work. This doesn't mean it's fake. Remember, Tantra is all about retraining perception. Perception is everything. One of the other primary means for training perception to perceive the Lama as the Buddha is Guru Yoga. Guru Yoga is pretty straightforward. I'm sure you're all familiar with it or experienced in the practice. It's usually the final practice of the preliminaries: refuge and prostration, mandala merit generation, vajrasattva purification, and Guru Yoga, which is designed to generate the pure vision of your teacher as an enlightened being. It is quite simply teacher worship, a way to train your mind and receive the unstained Dharma from the person who's transmitting it. You have to see the one who transmits the Dharma as pure, otherwise you might doubt the transmission, and your faith won't be strong enough to sustain your practice. Think of your doctor. If you doubt their credentials or their competency, how likely are you going to be to follow their advice? Tantric Buddhism asks the disciple to view the initiating Lama as a Buddha in order to fully implement the transition. One doesn't just simply decide to see one's teacher that way. By the time one gets to a transmission event, one has developed a certain amount of faith in the Lama. One's heard the name, one's received instruction, one's witnessed ritual performances, one may have read their books. Reputation and past successes matter. On accepting a Lama as one's teacher, one then has to generate the necessary perception of him or her as a Buddha. One has to generate faith and devotion. Guru Yoga as a preliminary is done individually, and it also takes center stage in public rituals such as the Gana Chakra, or the feast offering, SSIUK. The Lama is there to receive the offerings and bestow the blessings. They're serving as the Buddha's replacement. A good way to think about Guru Yoga is as a devotion practice, which is very common in religions around the globe. Think of the Hare Krishnas or the ecstatic love for Jesus. In India, this is known as Bhakti, a form of devotional love that is said to allow the devotee to transcend the ignorance of self. It is a love that is designed to be self-abasing, self-denying. One loses oneself in the God. It's an ecstatic humiliation. For any of those of you who have done prostration practice, you know the feeling of lowering your head before a holy image, visualized or embodied in a teacher. There's a sense of relief, of opening when you let go a bit of the ego. Devotion is a very powerful practice. And this form of guru worship isn't confined to rituals. Tantra asks that one expands the perception of the Lama to include all activities. There are texts in Tibet that describe proper conduct in the presence of one's guru, the ways in which one displays one's devotion and affirms the guru's status as a Buddha. Social norms have developed in Tibet to behave around the Lama. One is deferential. One uses elevated vocabulary, similar to Old English thou in place of you. Terminology used for Buddhas is also used for Lamas. You and I have eyes, mik. A Buddha and a Lama have chen. You and I have hands, lakpa. A Lama and a Buddha have chak. You've all probably seen how Lamas are treated akin to royalty, given thrones, the best food, deferential service, and so forth. Yes, one gains merit that way, like one gains merit for making an offering to a monk or a nun, or properly treating a holy image. But with a Lama, it's more. It's about engendering and maintaining a perception that the Lama is a Buddha, so that one's devotion can guide one on the path. So Guru Yoga is a method by which individual devotees develop the necessary devotion to the teacher. The Lama has to have the prerequisite authority for the right to function. The disciple has a role in engendering that through ritual practice. But the religion has many other means by which the authority of a Lama is developed and maintained. Another way by which this is achieved is through lineage. Just like all energy is said to come from the sun, in Buddhism, all authority is, in theory, directly derived from the Buddha. In terms of texts, authority is determined by the status of Buddhavacana, the word of a Buddha. A sutra is authentic if it is accepted as being the record of a teaching given or inspired by the Buddha. The reason sutras all start with "thus did I hear" is because the text is positioned as being a record of what Ananda heard the Buddha say. In the Pali Canon, if Ananda didn't hear it, it probably isn't the words of the Buddha. Early Buddhism relied on the authority of the Buddha and the authority of Ananda recording him. This was expanded in the Mahayana to allow for discourses of other Buddhas to be considered Buddhavacana. In Tibet, authenticity gained a new level of scrutiny due to the Dharma now being outside the land and language of its birth. In medieval Tibet, the compilers of the scriptural canon determined that only texts that were translated from an Indic language could be considered Buddhavacana. Thus, if a text, say the Vajrakila Tantra, did not have a known Sanskrit original, it was deemed apocryphal, inauthentic. It lacked the authority of an Indian origin. Tibetans were adamant that the teachings should not become corrupt through alterations or innovations. In the case of the Vajrakila Tantra, Sakya Pandita famously solved the problem when he discovered a Sanskrit version in the vast libraries at Sakya Monastery. So this has resulted in a very fertile tension in Tibetan literature between a conservative back to the basics impulse and a dynamic workaround that has given us the treasure tradition. That is, we have both a reverence for the translated scriptures of India and also for the Tibetan-produced texts that were taught in Tibet and revealed by Tibetans. In case any of you are not familiar with the treasure tradition, this literature is believed to have been taught by a man known in Tibet as the second Buddha, Padmasambhava, but concealed in the minds of disciples or physically in the rocks and soils of Tibet in the form of small scrolls or symbolic script. The reincarnations of these disciples would discover the teachings in their mind, or men and women would extract the physical objects from the ground, translate them, and then teach them as the words of Padmasambhava, and therefore as Buddhavacana. The fact that these emerge from the soil of Tibet is key. They're native, even if the mythology of their creation links them to the Indian master. A single teacher might embrace both of these categories of teachings. For example, the great early 20th century Nyingma Lama from Kham, Khenpo Zhenga, who was a founding teacher of several monastic colleges at great Nyingma, Kagyu, and Sakya monasteries, was famous for promoting the study of 13 Buddhist Sanskrit classics. And at the same time, he was a Dzogchen practitioner engaged in treasure liturgies. So that's texts, which all share this notion of Indian origin and thus authenticity. In terms of teachers, the relationship to the Buddha is manifested in lineage. All teachers who claim any degree of authenticity will likewise look to India and assert they received the teaching from a teacher who received it from a teacher all the way back to the Buddha, or a similar enlightened being like Vajradhara or Manjushri. In the cases of treasure, to Padmasambhava, who originally concealed the text, and thus to the person who extracted them. As an aside, most revealed treasures are actually ritual systems rather than sutras and tantras. In Tibet, the ritual literature is probably the most important. Very few people read scriptures. Anyone doing any practice, however, engages with liturgy. Most such material is not revelation either. An individual teacher formulated it during his or her lifetime and passed it on to their disciples. Because the teacher is an authority, their methods were therefore themselves authentic, and these are passed down via lineage transmissions. These transmissions are of two sorts. There is the empowerment transmission, by which one is authorized to perform the practice, and there's the reading transmission, by which one is given permission to read a text. You can get reading transmissions of great treatises or of ritual liturgies, which allow you to begin to engage with the practices, but one still needs the empowerment to perform it properly. In either case, these transmissions create a chain of master and disciple that together represent the lineage. An authentic teacher passes down an authentic teaching based either on a written text or an oral instruction. So I'm going to stop here and clarify some vocabulary that gets used a lot these days and is not often clearly defined. Lineage is not the same thing as tradition. Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya, Geluk, these are traditions, loosely confederated collections of institutions, doctrinal systems, and patriarchs that have enough coherence to be given a name. A lineage, however, might weave in and out of distinct institutions and traditions. Say the Ra system of Vajrabhairava, formulated by Ralatsawa Dorje Drakpa in the 11th century. He taught it to members of multiple traditions, and it continues to permeate them. This means that in terms of strict lineage progression, one's sectarian affiliation is not always relevant. The 19th century Sakya monk Jayant Chensei Wangpo could reveal a Dzogchen teaching concealed by Padmasambhava and pass it on to a Kagyu monk like Jamgon Kongtrul, or a Nyingma treasure revealer such as Chogyur Lingpa could give his Dzogchen revelations to both a Sakya and a Kagyu monk. So in the Treasury of Lives, we don't use school or sect or lineage to refer to the main Buddhist traditions of Tibet. There's no Drukpa Kagyu school and the like. We use tradition. Two teachers in the same tradition might espouse the same doctrine and both be Nyingma, for example, but they could be different members. They could be members of different Dzogchen lineages, depending on what teaching they held and from whom they received it. Traditions support the teaching and the practice, but it's lineage that keeps the teachings authentic by tracing it back to the source. So Buddhists across Asia are concerned with how to prove transmission. In the Zen tradition, for example, which traces all its lineages back to Bodhidharma, who is said to have brought the Dharma to the East, masters might present their students with inheritance certificates to authenticate the transmission of their teaching and even their enlightenment experience. Tibetans kept records of their transmission lineages. The fifth Dalai Lama and Jamgon Kongtrul are two examples of lamas whose records, known as senyek, literally a record of what has been heard. These are incredibly valuable historical resources and run over multiple volumes. Relics also serve the same function in both East Asia and Tibet. Possession of a lama's robe or staff or ritual implement can symbolize possession of the authentic transmission. Remember that a relic signifies the presence of a Buddha or the master, and so possession of that relic means the master is still present, aligned with and testifying to the authority of the master who possesses it. Another method of documenting lineage is painting. Tibetan art is full of these incredibly beautiful lineage paintings which authenticate the lineage depicted. The technique is to place one's own teacher into that lineage and show that he or she has the backing of the great saints. And let's see if I can figure out how to share my screen. I will give you, do you see my screen?
Not yet. Try touching in the middle of your screen, share screen. There should be a green arrow pointing upwards. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So here, for example, this is Rigzin Kunzan Sherab, who is the founder of Pelyul Monastery, and a huge Nyingma monastery in Kham. So right in the middle, you see Rigzin Kunzan Sherab. And then to this side, you see Namcha Mingyur Dorje, who was a treasure revealer who revealed the teachings on which the Pelyul tradition is based. And on the other side, you have Karma Chakme, who was Mingyur Dorje's sort of Karma Kagyu interlocutor. He was the one who wrote it all down. Mingyur Dorje was just a child who had these crazy visions. It was Karma Chakme who was able to write it down, publish it, and promote the teachings. And then, of course, on top, you have the Buddha, various other Buddhas, you have Padmasambhava, right? Another example is Dokyensa Yeshe Dorje, who was said to be a reincarnation of Jigme Lingpa, who had visions of Longchenpa, and of course, who carried on the Dzogchen teachings of Padmasambhava. So by putting Dokyensa Yeshe Dorje here, you're affirming his identity as an incarnation, affirming his position in the lineage of Padmasambhava, Longchenpa, Jigme Lingpa. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Good, all right. So Tibetan religious histories similarly authenticate transmission. For example, the Great Blue Annals by the 15th century Kagyu monk Gola Tsawa Zhenu Pel names thousands of people and is organized by distinct lineage transmission lines. You read this book and it's one master after another who gave it to whom, who gave it to whom, who gave it to whom, and it follows these lines of transmission over hundreds of years. All right, so how to become a Lama. As I put in my description of this talk, both Chinese and Western observers initially called Tibetan Buddhism Lamaism. These were people who had good first-hand contact with the Tibetan scene, and they saw lamas at the center. This word is not used today because it has a sort of pejorative sense of the religion being about lamas rather than about the Buddha. Yes, the lamas are at the center, and yes, there are rituals to worship them, but the lamas are ultimately the stand-in for the Buddha. It's not their religion, they didn't originate it, right? Tibetans consider themselves Buddhists, not Lamaists. So I've already spoken about how lineages are fashioned through rituals, paintings, literature, and transmission. But how does an individual person become a Lama? It isn't as simple as you might think. One doesn't simply study and practice. That makes you a scholar or a practitioner. Even the formal retreat program that was for the most part formulated in the mid-19th century by Jamgon Kongtrul, from which one graduates with the title Lama, isn't quite it. I know quite a few people who have done 3-year retreats, and they don't call themselves Lamas. So what's the difference between them and those who do? So I'm going to offer my own take on this. I would say a Lama is someone who transmits the Dharma. Maybe we can call this a lineage Lama. There are lay and ordained people who perform rituals and are known as Lamas, but I think this is a different category of person. A Lama who does the funeral service or does the rituals to ensure good harvest or to drive out a malicious spirit possessing an individual, these aren't people transmitting Dharma, at least in these activities. They might also transmit Dharma, but if they don't, I would not categorize them as a lineage Lama. There are also practitioners who sit in caves for years and master certain ritual systems of meditation. They might give blessings to people who come by, but not transmit Dharma. And there are monks who are highly educated, who serve in monastic colleges as assistant teachers, each evening going over with students the texts that the Lama taught in the morning. These are not lineage Lamas either. They've received the Dharma, but they don't transmit it forward. So if we go with the definition of a Lama as someone who transmits Dharma, then we have to ask how that individual gained the authority to transmit the Dharma. What gave them the right to do so? We've looked in the abstract at some doctrine and some rituals and institutions that allow for the implementation and maintenance of authority. But what of the individuals who possess that authority? How did they come to it? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that there's a single simple way of gaining that authority. You take it. It might be offered by your own teacher, colleagues, and students, but unless you assert it and convince others of your authenticity, you're not going to get it. In other words, it takes ambition to be a Lama. Sometimes the status of a Lama is given before one is ready to act on it. The most obvious example of this would be the Tuku, the Reincarnated Lamas. I expect you all know how this works. Following the death of a Lama of means, which is to say a Lama who has property and disciples, a reincarnation is sought out. Various supernatural clues are collected, omens and prophecies are debated, oracles are consulted. A child who exhibits religious inclinations are spoken about as possible reincarnation, and word gets out, and a match is made. The child is then trained to replace the departed Lama. He or she is given a corpus of transmissions, usually by the people who receive it from the previous incarnation, thereby placing them in a lineage of both transmission and rebirth. There is even an ideal of transmission by alternating incarnations. Examples of this are the Dalai Lamas and the Panchen Lamas, or the Karmapas and the Shamar, or Tsurpu Gyaltsap Lamas. You find this stated often. The Karmapas recognize and train the Shamapas, who recognize and train the Karmapas. But it rarely works out so nicely, as people don't always live the needed lengths of time. And not all kids accept the authority offered them. Most do, but some walk away. It was rare in pre-modern Tibet, but it did happen. And it's more common today when there are so many alternatives to the cloistered life. These incarnate Lamas still need to be part of a lineage. They aren't born into that. They need to have the teachings transmitted to them, and they need, once they're properly authorized through empowerment rituals, to engage with the tantric practices so as to master it if they intend to pass it forward. So the Tuku still has to receive teachings and practice and study and teach. Being identified as a reincarnation does not make one a Lama. It simply provides an easier path. An incarnation who is never recognized, we can at least theorize such a person, is not authorized to teach, nor is an incarnation who is never trained. There are examples of such people, like Tibetans who were swept up in the communist fervor of the 1950s and became cadres. Their identity could not be stripped from them, but they were not Lamas because they didn't do the job. So there are rituals to instill and develop authority. But again, unless there's the will, the ambition, one will not become a Lama. A master must empower you, and your students have to cultivate devotion and treat you properly, but you still have to get out and assert your authority. The public is not going to simply accept it. So I'm going to give you a few examples from the lives of 3 of the greatest masters of the 19th century, Jamgon Kongtrul, Jaya Chense Wangpo, and Chogyur Lingpa. These were essentially self-made Lamas who employed multiple strategies to gain the authority they needed to do their work. They supported each other and worked together to such a degree that they're still known as the triad of Khyentse, Kongtrul, and Churling, Chen Kong Chok De Sum, they say in Kham. Churling's treasures, for example, were largely written by Kongtrul and Khyentse, meaning he dictated and they edited, expanded, and put them on paper. Their collaboration served to reinforce their individual and their collective authority, lifting them all up as a group. So Jamgon Kongtrul was born with some advantages. His father was a Bön priest, and he had some connection with a Bön Lama that afforded him some additional status. This gained him access to a small Bön monastery as a child, where he learned to read and write, probably the single most important step to becoming a Lama in Tibet. Literacy was rare and highly valued, and from the monastery, he went into the employ of a compassionate Derge official, and from there, first to a Nyingma monastery, Zhechen, and then to a Kagyu monastery, Pelpong. Because at this point, he had evident intellectual skills and connections with an official who was also a donor to the monastery, a senior Lama at Pelpong arranged to have Kongtrul given a Tuku identity in order to tie him to Pelpong. The worry was that he would be taken away to court service. They gave him the identity of a disciple of the 8th Situ named Kongpo Bamteng Tuku, who had not been especially distinguished and who had not built any institutional structures. No one had been looking for his reincarnation. This didn't give Kongtrul any great status. The leadership of Pelpong simply needed a name connected to Situ, the head of the monastery. Kongtrul resisted, hoping to return to Zhechen, where he had a beloved teacher, Shechen Wontrul, and he never really forgave the Pelpong Lama who made all the arrangements, Karmatek Truk Temple. But he accepted his transfer to Pelpong, and he became a devoted disciple to the 9th Situ, Pemeninje. Kongtrul's Tuku identity was basically a ruse to keep him at the monastery and out of government service. It gained him no status at the monastery, and in fact, he faced opposition from monks who were suspicious of his Bön and Nyingma affiliations. He had no institutional Karma Kagyu support, but he was brilliant, and he quickly demonstrated his skills in composition, teaching, and ritual performance. His activity grew, and he fashioned powerful networks of colleagues at other monasteries in the region, notably Khyentse Wangpo, whose seat, Dzongtsar, was just over a ridge. But still, he was essentially a no-name Tuku. You can hear in his diary the struggle with this. He wanted to do great things, but he didn't yet have the authority to do them. In the mid-1850s, when he was in his 30s, he set out to literally rewrite the main ritual manuals of the Kagyu tradition, and he needed more authority to pull it off. This would be known as the Treasury of Kagutantra, one of his 5 treasuries, for which he's justly famous. To gain the authority, he decided to document his past lives. Speaking of the undertaking of the Treasury of Kagutantra, he wrote in his diary, "I did not know of the quality of my previous or future incarnations, or the strength of my aspirations. This task might be harmful to my lifespan, possibly blocking my progress to liberation, or even detrimental to Buddhism. I therefore had put it off. Now that it was unavoidable, I needed to muster my resolve." What he means is that setting out on a major project like this without the authority of a line of eminent saints behind him was dangerous. He could be dismissed as a nobody attempting a big change, and his work would be rejected, ridiculed. Harmful to him, harmful to the work, harmful to Buddhism. I don't doubt his sincerity in this. He knew that if he produced this massive work without the proper authorization, he would not be successful. His drive to elevate his authority was indistinguishable from his drive to teach Dharma. So he mustered the resolve and established a record of his past lives. He did this with the aid of his close colleague Jayant Khyentse Wangpo and a well-placed incarnation of Pelpong, Dabzang Tuku, who was also a friend. Churling at this point was not yet in the picture. The names he would come up with would be attested by people who had authority, and so they would be accepted in his community. Both Khyentse and Dabzang did certain rituals and received visions. Dabzang came up with Terdak Lingpa, the 17th century Nyingma treasure revealer and founder of Mindrling Monastery. Terdak Lingpa was already known to have 14 exalted previous births, including Vairocana, Sakyapandita, Longchenpa, and Taranatha, all lions of Tibetan Dharma in the major traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. Khyentse came up with 2 people, one, a man named Trengpo Terten, whose own past lives included Khyumpo Neljor, Lama Jang, and the great translator Rinchen Zangpo, and another man, Lume Tsultrim Sherab, who restored the Vinaya to Samye at the start of the second diffusion of Buddhism to Tibet in the 11th century. Kongtrul didn't just tell a few people about this and then get to work. He wrote an entire history of his past lives, which is published, a testament to how seriously he took the need. Being the reincarnation of these great masters gave Kongtrul the authority to refashion the main liturgies of his tradition. But note also the ecumenical character of the collection of saints. This wasn't unusual in Tibet. Tibetans aren't so sectarian that they don't recognize the enlightenment of masters from other traditions. This list of past lives would give Kongtrul the authority to do editing and compiling of literature across the traditions. Kongtrul's colleague Trygve Lingpa took a different path to establishing his authority. Churling's father was not a priest, and he had no uncle in a monastery to serve as patron, two key advantages for remarkable children to be noticed and placed in an incarnation lineage. Churling was a monk at a small monastery when he started having visions of Padmasambhava, in which he was given instructions to perform the Cham ritual dance in a new way. This, and the fact that he seems to have taken a female companion, got him kicked out of his monastery. In the 1850s, he showed up at Pelpung around the same time that Kongtrul was building out his past lives. He tried first to gain Situ Rinpoche's support by describing a revelation he had received and asked to transmit it, but Situ refused. You don't just accept a transmission from anyone. What if they're fake? Situ was a nice man, however, and he suggested that Churling go off himself and practice his own treasure, and he gave him a little support to do so. This was so that he could later examine and see if there was any benefit to it, and to see if Churling was serious. Situ unfortunately passed away soon after Churling arrived. Somewhat impatient and initially failing with Situ, Churling attempted to convince Dabzang Tuku and Kongtrul that he was a true, authentic treasure revealer. These two were not terribly impressed either, and they suggested he go elsewhere. So he went to Dzongsar and received some initiations from Khyentse, and over the course of several years, going back and forth between the two monasteries and following the two great masters on their excursions, he gained a little recognition for the quality of his visions, and Kongtrul and Khyentse decided to support him. What I think happened was that Kongtrul and Khyentse, who were both monks, were in the market for a treasure revealer who could play the role of the tantric mystic. Churling was exceptional, charismatic, and incredibly productive. He was having visions all over the place, massive visions of new ritual systems and deities. He revealed some of the most famous treasure cycles of the century, including the dispelling of all obstacles, or Barche Kunzel, and the light of wisdom. Kongtrul and Khyentse wrote down most of them. They essentially formulated his visions in the written word, something they were particularly skilled at. And again, this is fairly typical of the Tibetan treasure revealer, as we saw with Namcha Mingyur Dorje and Karma Chakme. The revelation comes in a form that's not necessarily comprehensible. It needs to be translated, structured, given a shape that can be engaged with. It's almost always a team effort. Churling would go on to reveal treasure for the 14th Karmapa and to produce his famous vision of the 20 Karmapa incarnations. Another way in which Churling gained the support of Kongtrul and Khyentse, who he needed to attest to the validity of his revelations and to further gain community support, was through a remarkable gazetteer of Kham that literally refashioned the geography of Eastern Tibet to validate his treasures. This is the so-called 25 Great Sites of Kham, which is sort of a misnomer since there's 42 places on the map. It's very well known today. There's 5 main places, each in the categories of enlightened body, speech, mind, activities, and qualities, each with the 5 subsidiary sites by the same scheme. So there's a mind site of the body, etc., followed by 8 sites that guide beings and 4 exceptional sites. Some of these were already well-known power places like Drinyendong, a mountain sacred to the royal family of Dege, and the Langtang Dolma temple. On the list were all the places that Churling had already revealed treasure, and he left a lot of places unidentified for future revelations. Now, Churling produced this gazetteer right when Kongtrul was developing his own hermitage, Tsadra Rinchen Drak, and Khyentse was developing his personal meditation cave, Pema Shelpuk. Churling put both of these places on the map. Tsadra is the mind aspect of the Buddha attribute, and Pema Shelpuk is the speech aspect of the Buddha attribute. You can't travel Kham these days without hearing about this scheme. Oh, that mountain over there is one of the 25 sites, etc. The effect was immediate. Churling's treasures were valid because they were revealed at authentic power places, places that were known to have been practice sites of Padmasambhava. The new places on the list were valid by association, including Kongtrul and Khyentse's personal practice sites. Any future activity at places yet identified would likewise be authentic. And if the treasures were authentic, then so too was the man who revealed them. And now I'll give you one more example of how they served each other's needs for affirming their authority. And this is a particularly beautiful one. So in 1857, when Kongtrul was in full swing developing Tsador Rinchen Drak and was setting out to compile another of his 5 treasuries, the Rinchen Terzin, or Treasury of Revelations, Kongtrul asked Khyentse and Chöling for suggestions about it. Khyentse told him that he liked the idea and he recommended an organizing structure to the collection. Chöling, however, did something far better. He told Kongtrul, I'm going to read from my book a bit. So Chöling told Kongtrul, in periods such as these, when I am meeting Guru Rinpoche in person, it is the perfect opportunity to ask him such questions. I will remember to put this matter to him, and I will not forget his response. So Chöling literally went and revealed treasure, and he received a reply to Kongtrul, and Kongtrul recorded it. The main gist appeared to be that I had received an edict to the effect that, based on the force of my karmic propensity and aspirations, I was permitted to include in the Treasury of Revelations whatever I wished to. So I'm going to keep reading a little bit. So Kongtrul had initially relied on Khyentse's authority in deciding which cycles to include in the Treasury of Revelations. As the project proceeded, having practiced treasured revelations himself, Kongtrul's confidence grew in his own authority to make his own decisions. Yet Tibetans shy away from bold personal statements of abilities and privileges. Authority is generally reflected in the repeated words of praise by one's peers, or in the figure of deities who manifest to declare a person's worth and rights. Khyentse had not told Kongtrul he was qualified to decide for himself which cycles to include in the Treasury of Revelations. So Kongtrul turned to somebody who would, an even higher power, Padmasambhava. To do that, he needed a credible messenger. And when Chogyal Lingpa presented himself as preparing to speak to Padmasambhava, Kongtrul saw the opportunity. Treasure revealers are mediums. They reach one hand into the supernatural and draw something out with the other to the other side. Kongtrul would continue to rely on Khyentse for advice, but now he had the word of Padmasambhava that he could include whatever he wanted. So I'm not suggesting that Kongtrul or Chöling were somehow fraudulent because they had to establish their authority, or that they were charlatans tricking us all into believing something that isn't true. I don't think authority, because it's ultimately made up, is somehow not real. That would be naive, no less naive than to think that authority is given at birth. Doctors have to have ambition and training. To get placed in positions where they can help others, they have to draw attention to themselves. They have to write their resumes in a way that make them sound amazing. They have to convince you that they're qualified. To me, it's the Lama's drive, their dedication, the effort to do what they need to do their work that makes them inspirational. And documenting the process is one of the main functions of Tibetan life writing, which I'll talk briefly about now. The examples I've just given you were literary, right? In order to fashion my narratives of how Kongtrul and Chöling established their authority, and obviously the stories I've told are just part of the whole picture, I relied on written material. That doesn't actually suggest some distance, but rather I'm using the literature in a way that it was specifically intended. Kongtrul left his diary to be read by others so that they would be inspired. Tibetans build authority in many, many ways, and literature is chief among them. Hagiography is a huge section of the Tibetan literary output, and testifying to the authenticity of the Lama is one of its 2 main functions. Tibetan hagiography, as you probably know, is called namtar, which literally means liberation, or moksha, but which is used to mean liberation story, as in the story of a person's liberation. I use the word hagiography, literally the life of a saint, because for the most part, these narratives follow certain conventions of the genre. They attest to the Lama's education, recognition if he's a tuku, teachings and transmissions received, rituals performed such as retreats, compositions, and revelations, teachings given, institutions established, and miracles performed. Most of them are replete with supernatural events that occur before or during conception, birth, youth, and into adulthood. Lamas leave footprints in rocks. They pluck statues out of the sky. They pacify wild animal. They cure the ill and revive the dead. They have visions of saints and deities. All the things you would expect a Buddha to do. Now I'm going to give you an example of a namtar from that just got published on an exciting new website called TibShelf, which is a publishing platform for short translations of Tibetan texts. It's from the hagiography of the 3rd Muratuku, Pema Dechen Zangpo, who lived in the 19th century. And I'm going to try and share my screen again so you can see what I'm reading from. All right. So here's TibShelf. So I'll read just a few passages. The great spiritual friend, widely known as the third Mura Pema Dechen Zangpo, an actual emanation of Avalokiteshvara, was a direct disciple of both Khenchen Pema Vajra and Patrul Jingme Choki Wangpo. The basis for his emanation is as follows, and it gives you first some of the deities, second incarnation, first incarnation, and then the third incarnation. In concordance with what was mentioned earlier regarding emanations appearing as one or many, simultaneously or instantaneously, in accordance with the specific dispositions and inclinations of sentient beings, the third incarnation, the kind and glorious Mura Pema Dechen, was the last to arrive. Once again, he intentionally took rebirth as a spiritual friend of all Vajra holders, possessing the 3 vows, as in the latter half of the 14th sexagenary cycle, in a Getse settlement situated in Zachuka, Dokam. He took birth into a divine house where many sublime beings had been born. As soon as he spoke, he recited the 6-syllable Mani mantra. He possessed the nature of someone totally beyond that of an ordinary person, as his heart was filled with immeasurable love, compassion, and varied other qualities. Drubang Dzogchenpa Mingyur Namke Dorje recognized and decided that he was the unmistakable incarnation of the previous Mura and installed him on the monastic seat. And you can go on and read more of that. I really recommend the site. I think it's terrific. So obviously this Mura Tuku was amazing, right? Amazing from birth. As I mentioned earlier, there are 2 main functions of a namtar. The first is to affirm the authority of the Lama. The second is to inspire the student. And here it gets tricky. On the one hand, the miracle stories are inspiring because they engender devotion. I'm an educated 21st century American, but if I were to hear an infant reciting mantra, and in some cases toddlers are said to recite Sanskrit texts, I would be struck by energizing faith. But I also have my doubts when I read this stuff. As a Buddhist, I'm moved by the stories of people who overcome hardship, who have such dedication, such ambition, that they're willing to sit for 12 years in wind-filled caves and to cross great distances to receive teachings. I'm inspired by dedication and hard work, because for me to do any Dharma, it's hard work. As a regular person, I'm inspired by people who started out as regular people and accomplished the promises of the Buddhist path. The Namtar shows us that the Lama did it, and so can we. And here, the genre has some internal conflicts. Hagiographies are written by devotees. They are expressions of devotion, of faith. They are portraits of one's Lama, of the Buddha who brought one to one's current status, the teacher, the parent, the guide, the protector. Remember, these are people who are tasked with perceiving their Lama as Buddhas. It's exceedingly uncommon, therefore, that the devotee is going to write something like, my beloved teacher was a jerk as a child, or could hardly read or write, or was really lazy. They're going to have a really difficult time exposing the Lama's shortcomings, of his failures, his dead end. And they're going to have a really hard time starting out their story of the Lama as just a regular person. As with the example above, the hagiography is going to be glowing from start to finish. That means we get hagiographies of children who were born in a blaze of rainbow light, to mothers who had visions of deities, who sat up in their first months and declared that they wanted to go back to their monasteries, who were disinterested in the non-religious activities as children, kids who learned to read with no effort, and so on. These are inspirational beings, but hardly models of what I can set out to do. The goal of the Namtar, to fashion the Lama as a great being, and thereby engendering faith in the disciple, thereby often conflicts with its function of inspiring the disciple by providing a model of the path. A person who was perfect at birth might be a suitable object of devotion, but he's not a suitable model for our own struggles. So I'm going to give you a very famous passage from the life of Milarepa. If I can find it. I'm pulling it up. So this is from the translation. Oh, I've got it over here. This is a translation, a recent translation of the life of Milarepa by Andrew Quintman. So in it, a disciple, this happens towards the end of the book, after Milarepa's gained enlightenment. And one of his disciples comes up to him and says, I beg the Jetson to tell us whether he is an emanation of Vajradhara or of a Bodhisattva. The Jetson replied, I have no idea whose emanation I am. But even were I an emanation from the 3 lower realms, meaning the hell realms, if you regard me as Vajradhara or someone similar, you will receive his blessings by virtue of your devotion. Although this belief that I am an emanation comes from your pure perception of me, there is no greater misunderstanding of Dharma. This is because you do not recognize the greatness of perfectly practicing pure Dharma. And then Milarepa goes on and reminds his disciple that he was a murderer, that he murdered many people, he destroyed entire villages, he practiced black magic, he was a horrible, horrible person. And then he practiced the Dharma and he got enlightened. So if he's telling his disciple, if you think that I'm an emanation of the Buddha, well, great, because you'll get devotion by praying to me as Vajradhara, right, as the Buddha. Your devotion will give you benefit. But if you think of me, he says, as an emanation, as pure from the start, then you're missing the entire point of my life story. He was worse than all of us, and he still was able to get enlightened. That's how powerful the Dharma is, and that's the model of Milarepa. And that's why his life story is still read by so many people, because he's a model of turning from an ordinary person, or even worse than ordinary, to a Buddha. So on the Treasury of Lives, we strive to avoid hagiography and do biography. We might mention that tradition holds that a child recited the Manjushri Namasamgiti at age 3, for example, but we don't say that he did, and more often than not, then we just leave it out. Our goal is to show that these were real people who earned their status as great teachers. So now to wrap up, I want to return to my so-called agenda. When I wrote my book about Kongtrul, depicting his humanity was one of the foremost ideas I kept in mind. There are several books about Kongtrul out there, about his retreat center, about his ritual work. And as there are many translations of his work, there are many introductions to him and his life. Many of these depict him as an aloof, removed Lama. To do so, the author had to twist their narrative into remarkable contradictions. On a single page describing how Kongtrul supervised the construction of a temple, and then stating that he never concerned himself with practical affairs, that he never got his hands dirty with worldly concerns. You can't build a temple without getting your hands dirty, without being concerned with raising money, employing workers, seeing that those workers are fed, getting the materials, without working really hard to secure patronage from local leaders. Lamas who build monasteries don't supervise while sitting on a cloud miles up in the sky. A lot of Western hagiography of Tibetan Lamas seem to have taken to an extreme the notion of the Lama being perfect from birth. I find this incredibly disturbing. It bothers me as a historian because it removes the person from the social context in which he or she lived. It also bothers me as a Buddhist. To me, a bodhisattva who is not part of the world is not a very effective being. Can you feel devotion to a being who looks down on us and declines to get their hands dirty? Worse, there's a tendency to view all the Lama's activities as expressions of his enlightenment. This is incredibly dangerous. It's foolish. I remember a monk friend laughing at some Americans who were talking about the greatness of their shared teacher. The monk, who lived with his teacher and served him, told me the Lama farts, and these farts are not enlightened farts, they're just farts. Another way of putting this, Holly Gailey, a professor at the University of Colorado and a longtime Shambhala practitioner and teacher, said it this way: this elevation, this idealization doesn't leave room to human encounter, the kind of accountability that's needed in Buddhist communities for their teachers. There's another obvious downside to this notion of an infallible Lama, and you're seeing it blow up in sanghas across Europe and the Americas. The horrible sex scandals that break your heart, in which a Lama has betrayed his authority, and the ways in which disciples twist themselves into knots to deny it. Both of these are incredibly harmful to those who suffered the abuse, to all the disciples. It is incredibly difficult to be grateful to a person for their teaching and still be able to call out bad behavior. The unwillingness to do so, the erroneous notion that a Lama can do no harm because the Lama is a Buddha, is what allows these abuses to continue. So I'm going to close with this. Just as Tibetan hagiographies have this tension between the need to portray the Lama as perfect and at the same time narrate the transition from an imperfect being to a Buddha, so too do we all have a responsibility to perceive our Lama as perfect when we are sitting on our cushion or participating in a ritual, and at the same time to recognize that they are human beings who serve a function, who are for the most part selflessly giving themselves to us for our own benefit. We have to see Lamas as both human and Buddhas. Their humanity is in the ambition and the drive that got them to the cushion. That is where they are the models for our lives. We ought to recognize and thank them for that, because ultimately, this is what Tantra tasks us with doing, both for our teacher and for ourselves. We are tasked with finding the Buddha in our humanity. And I am finished. So with that, if you have any questions, I'm happy to entertain some.
Thank you so much, Alex, for a wonderful talk. Really so rich, so many themes you've brought up, from history to reincarnations to literature. So let me unmute everybody if I succeed in doing that. Let's see. Mute my audio. No. 1 second. Ask to unmute. And also, if you want to write your questions in the chat, you're welcome to. Let me see, I'm still not finding this. Mute all, no. Okay, here, I think I'm nearly there. 1 second. Ask all to unmute. Are you unmuted now? No?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
I heard the voice. Okay, great.
Yes. So yeah, you just need to, I mean, that's the thing, you have to ask to unmute, and then that's when you allow everyone to unmute themselves. Still, everyone need to do their own work of clicking the button of unmuting themselves.
Okay, so if anybody, thank you. If anybody has questions, let's just please start with the questions. Or if you don't, I'll have, does anybody want to write in the chat if you're having trouble unmuting yourselves? Sorry, I'm not too technical with this. Okay, allow participants to unmute themselves. Can you unmute yourselves? I'm just not sure if anybody wants to.
Yeah, we can. We can. Thank you, Damian.
Okay, great. Okay, do beware, we do hear you all. That's the problem, unmuting everybody.
Yeah. I think Alex might be unmuted. Alex, did you have a question?
No, I'm unmuted, but I hear somebody talking, and I'm not sure if it's if someone's asking me a question or not.
No, they're chatting away. So maybe I'll try to mute everybody again, but with the option to unmute. Unless somebody has a question immediately, otherwise I have one.
I've got one.
Okay, there you go, Nigel, please.
I know your website. I've read it, and I absolutely understand what you're saying, the difference between history and hagiography. And it incredibly excites me. It seems to me that when I read Buddhist literature, it kind of falls into two groups. It falls into books written for disciples, which students, which kind of present hagiography as history, but without really kind of coming clean. And then there's the other sort of material, which is scholarly material, which for most Buddhists practitioners is not really available, partly because of the way it's written, but also, you know, it's not so easy to kind of find it. That says to me that there is a third position between those two genres of writing, where there is, which I think you're kind of embodying in yourself this evening, where on the one hand, we are a practitioner, but we're not kind of giving up our intelligence in the process of doing that. I started off studying theology, you know, when I was a very young man, and it seems to me that Christianity went through a process where its faith kind of grew up and became less childlike. And it seems to me that you're kind of inviting us, the Buddhist community, to make a parallel shift.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's my question. Well, not a question. It's a kind of a hooray, really.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's very encouraging, because that is exactly what I'm trying to do with the Treasury of Lives. I'm trying to give information in a way that's accessible to scholars, to people who are interested in history, but also to practitioners and people of faith, because I think it can be done. And I think it's happening more and more. I would say in early days of Buddhist scholarship, it was very dry, divorced from devotion. You had, and in fact, my teachers would tell me, you can't admit that you're a Buddhist. You can't admit that you have faith, because you won't be taken seriously by the academy. And that's less so now. And I think the more material comes out, the less the reader is inclined, I hope, to take things literally, right? I mean, we read that Padmasambhava flew over a mountain and did conquest with demons, and an incredibly beautiful story, right? In the same way we read stories of someone in the Bible, Methuselah, lived 900 years. Well, we don't have to take that literally, right? That's a teaching. It's there to instruct us on something. What does that mean? And there are many ways of looking at it. But as history, no. I mean, we're not going to read that as history. We can write history in a way that supports the Dharma, in a way that that tells stories that are interesting and provocative and meaningful, without diminishing one's faith at the same time. And I think more and more scholars are doing that. And also, one of the great legacies of the 3-year retreat centers that Kala Rinpoche and other great lamas put together in the West is that people are coming out very well trained in translation. And so they're doing really good translations of Buddhist scriptures and Buddhist histories and biographies that don't approach things literally, that tell the story as poetry or parable. Right? I mean, we have these categories in the West, parable, right? We don't take it literally, we take it as a teaching. And I think more and more students are willing to engage on this level, which I think is great.
Yeah. And the parallel, the transition that Christianity has been through, do you feel that might be happening within the Buddhist community as well? And taking not coming so literal.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably true. I mean, Christian studies in the academy is much older. I would only be wary of that comparison, because Christian communities are sort of shrinking, right? Faith is sort of drying up. I mean, people were sort of forced to take one side or the other, and they took, they sort of left their religion behind them, which I think is really unfortunate. And I wouldn't want that to happen with Buddhism. So.
I hadn't thought of that. Oh dear. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you.
We have a question from Louis Marchant as well. She wrote it on the chat. I don't know if you see it, Alex, but it says, did Tibetan teachers have to learn Sanskrit in order to study texts? And if so, who taught them? Thank you.
Very rarely. I mean, you do have examples of lamas studying Sanskrit. In fact, I'm working right now on the Treasury of Lives of a biography of Dedrung Rinpoche, which I get to rely on David Jackson's amazing. If you don't know it, it's called Saint in Seattle. It's a spectacular biography of this 20th century Lama Dedrung Rinpoche, Sakya Lama, and he was sent by his teacher to learn Sanskrit from Kunu Lama, who was a Lama from North India, who was traveling around Tibet. And so on one hand, you had his Lama telling him to go learn Sanskrit so that he could read the classic scriptures. He had other teachers saying, don't waste your time with that. You don't need to. Everything's translated. Come on, don't be silly. So there is that tension in Tibetan Buddhism. Very few lamas would learn Sanskrit, and they might do it only to be able to write poetry or to learn sort of classic grammar so that they can write in verse. It's definitely not necessary, because literally everything's been translated, sometimes multiple times. So I see another one. Could one say that the lineage trees depicted in tankas act as a kind of pictorial hagiography? Definitely. You can't necessarily say that, like the one I showed you of Dokensei, right? You know, you have, I mean, it's very hagiographical to say he's a reincarnation of Jigme Lingpa, right? So that's a devotional statement. So you see that depicted. There are amazing refuge field paintings. There's one, we have it actually on the Treasury of Lives. If you go to images, we have this Kagyu lineage refuge field, which has just dozens of Kagyu lamas depicted. And yeah, you prostrate to all the lamas at once, right? And then you see how they're all connected. Oh, this is my tradition. This is my lineage. This is where I belong. This is where my lama belongs. So yeah, these are very devotional objects.
Any other questions? Please speak up.
Yeah, I've got a question. Thank you so much for your talk. It was very, very interesting. My question is that you referred to Kongtrul being given the title of a tulku,
right?
That it was a kind of construct,
right?
Do you think the tulku is always a construct or sometimes a reality?
You know, honestly, I'm going to give you an honest answer, which is I can't answer that question. I was in, I mean, I'll tell you something personal. I went to a Tsurpu monastery in the early 1990s after the 17th Karmapa was just identified and installed. And no, sorry, early 2000s. No, early 1990s, right? I'm trying to remember when. And I went into the room. He was just a little kid, and he was sitting on this throne, and there was this long line of lamas, and you would go through, and you'd prostrate, and he would bop you on the head, and then you would leave. And it was like chilling. It was so. I mean, I was young. I was like traveling to Tibet. I was like really eager, but it was really chilling. And I don't know if that was my devotion producing that, or if he had his own presence, you know, separate from me. I don't know.
What do you mean by chilling? Chilling sounds something bad.
No, it was chilling. Like I literally was shaking. I mean, it was moving. It was like, I felt it physically, right? Yeah, not chilling as in scary, chilling as in like, I had chills, right? And at the same time, you're reading over the historical record of Tibet. Tibetans are not, it was really, you know, like we can talk about this naive inability to read between the lines and read parables, you know, this tendency of people to read parables as literal, you know, or to take everything literally. You know, Tibetans are not so naive either. Their literature is full of stories in which this happens and this happens. Kongtrul left he left a very clear record of his disdain for this tuku identity he was given. He was very clear that it was hoisted on him. He did not appreciate it. He did not want it. And in his record, this very long story of his previous births, he doesn't mention him. Kongpo Bamtem Tuku is not in it. He dismissed it. He thought it was ridiculous. He thought it was designed to keep him at the monastery. This is not my interpretation. This is what Kongtrul says. So they know what's going on. They know that there are institutional concerns here, that, you know, the institution needs a new head. If you read monastic histories, there's this struggle to find the next incarnation and to train him properly so that he can get resources, can go off and do tours. And you see this in even the hagiographies, blaming this struggle between two factions over who gets to control the tuku. This stuff is in plain sight. So I don't think Tibetans either take this stuff literally. At the same time, I think they fully, absolutely believe that these are the reincarnations of their Lama. Because, I mean, if you buy Buddhist doctrine, if you buy Buddha nature, if you buy reincarnation, then why not? You know, why wouldn't the Lama come back? Why wouldn't the Lama say, I'm going to come back here, go find me, train me, I'll keep teaching you? Why not? I mean, it's not illogical, right? So yes and no, right? I mean, I think, you know, I mean, it's a matter of faith, right? So you can't say yes or no, you have to say both. But at the same time, there is the historical record of how this is all done. And I think that's worth looking at, how it's done, right? Because how it's done is how we're doing it, you know, and if we're going to do it, we have to know how to do it. You know, we have to take it seriously, you know, which doesn't mean literally, but we have to take it seriously.
Good, thank you.
Welcome.
There's another question in the chat from Snehi. You see it?
Yeah. So what is the context for the Tuku tradition in Tibet, but nothing similar for Buddhism in India? So why did the Tibetans do it, but previously they didn't? You know, it's a uniquely Tibetan institution, the Tuku. Tuku is the Tibetan translation of Nirmanakaya, which is, you know, a Sanskrit word which means emanation. It's one of the three bodies of the Buddha: the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya. So, you know, the doctrine came from India, but the institution really came from Tibet, and you know, it came from having the Lama be so important in the community. When the Lama is gone, it's a huge, huge vacuum. It's a huge power vacuum. And it's a struggle. If you think your Lama is enlightened, why would they die, right? That doesn't make sense. So of course they're going to keep come back. So, I mean, you obviously, Nepal is Tibetan Buddhism, Ladakh. So in India, in Nepal, Bhutan, you have the Lama, but it's really, it's a function of Tibetan Buddhism. You don't have it in other Buddhist traditions.
There's another question as well in the chat I see has appeared.
So how do modern hagiographies compare to those historic hagiographies, you mean? Like is there a new model of hagiography?
Yeah.
I would.
I'm just intrigued about what's coming out now.
Right. I would say that the hagiographies follow the similar sort of requirements of the genre that I sort of mentioned. You know, the sort of glowing depiction, the miracles, all that sort of thing. You still see that. You can read a hagiography of you know, recently departed lamas that follow that same genre, but at the same time, you can read Tibetan compositions that are not that way, that are a little more fluid, a little more human, maybe. But I still, you know, I want to stress, I think, I mean, I would encourage you all to read hagiographies, but read them as poetry, read them as parables, read them as what they're intended to be, inspirational teachings, right? Not as, you know, there is history in them, but they're not straight up history. I mean, really the great example is, at least in the American context, is George Washington cutting down the cherry tree, right? It's something that all kids in America are told, or used to be, you know, George Washington, our great founding father, cut down, you know, took an axe and cut down this cherry tree of his parents or neighbors and something. And then when he was asked about it, did you cut down this cherry tree? He said, I cannot lie. Yes, I did. You know, and of course that didn't happen, you know, of course that didn't happen, but it's a teaching tale. It's a teaching, like, the people who founded our great nation are truthful, right? Even in youth, they always told the truth, right? I mean, it's a teaching tale. So I think that's how Tibetan hagiographies are intended, right? And we read them that way, we can then be inspired, we can receive the teachings, right? So I think, I mean, I would say Tibetan writers, Tibetan authors are influenced by sort of Western ways of writing history and biography. But I would also say the opposite. I would say Western authors are influenced by traditional Tibetan hagiography and are producing traditional Tibetan style hagiography, which is weird, I think, you know. So.
Yeah, I guess maybe one of the questions within that was also, you know, is it a little bit more toned down? And you've touched on it in terms of the Westerners writing the hagiographies, because now the authors are different. I mean, some of them that I see with, you know, Buddhism coming west and having these lamas and rinpoches having Western students, they are being written by Westerners, but in a how do I say like a, not an appropriated way, there's still the structure, but I don't know, maybe there's a different kind of flavor or a different audience.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I think that's very likely to be the case. And I mean, I would certainly say that you know, in Tibetan hagiography in general, across the many centuries that it's been written, there are many sort of levels of the supernatural. I mean, you can find hagiographies that are really very, very light on that and are more like Milarepa's, you know, that take seriously the, you know, no, this person was a jerk, you know. I mean, even actually on Tib Shelf, there's another hagiography up there in which it says at the very beginning, this guy was really a brutal, violent kid. So they do exist, and that's a traditional Tibetan hagiography. So those examples are out there too. And definitely, you know, Tibetan Buddhism and the literature that's coming out now is influenced by, you know, by the literature of the West and of different traditions. I mean, so it's one of the exciting things about things that are happening now, right? Sort of cross-fertilization.
Okay, if there are not any more questions, then I would suggest, oh, I see one hand waving. Do I see a hand waving? Yeah, Nigel, you have to unmute yourself somehow. Click on the red mic with that. I'm afraid I can't unmute.
Yep.
Yeah, I've done it.
Yep.
Okay, this is kind of a question about going into the future. I mean, we know the Tulku system came with the, I think it was the second Karmapa.
Mm-hmm.
What's that, 12th century?
Right.
So it's not always been there. And there are definite signs that it's getting a little bit ragged around the edges.
Yeah.
Presently.
Yeah.
So we've got a real Buddhist thing there, haven't we? Things have a beginning and an end. But also what is so clear from your talk today is how absolutely integral and central and unremovable the Lama comes Tulku is for the practice of Tantrism. So it seems to me that there's a really interesting kind of tension there. And people who say, well, maybe we're going to have Tibetan Buddhism in the future without the Tulku, and I know there are at least one Tulku who said that. It's difficult to imagine how that's going to look like. So I wondered if you have any comments on that one.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, remember that you don't have to be reincarnated to be a Lama. I mean, there are great teachers who are active today who don't claim any previous incarnation, right? So you can study and train and practice and become a Lama, you know, some like Kongtrul did, or like Chögyal Lingpa, you know, that is still a viable option. But definitely there are a lot of people in Tibetan Buddhism, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who have floated the idea of getting rid of the whole institution. There's a little known and very undocumented meeting that apparently happened in the 1960s in exile. The Dalai Lama is said to have gathered some of the great incarnations together and said, let's stop doing this. Let's stop recognizing incarnations. And a lot of them were on board. A lot of them saw this as real problematic. You know, but then a lot of them saw it as like integral to preserving the tradition, right? Training the next generation of teachers. It's sort of it's the fast track to getting a teacher, right? You can become a Lama at 15, really, if you're recognized as an incarnation. Otherwise, it takes, you know, decades. So so that won over. But there are definitely many examples also of great Lamas who have said, I'm not going to reincarnate. Don't look for me. You know, Mipam Rinpoche, right? The 19th century, 20th century Nyingma Lama is very famously said, I'm not going to reincarnate. Don't look for me. You know, unfortunately, he said, my next birth is going to be in Shambhala, which sort of gave Trungpa Rinpoche an option of finding his son in the Shambhala community as Mipam Rinpoche. So you got to be careful what you say if you're not going to reincarnate. But yeah, it's all over the place, right? I certainly know people who say they don't want anything to do with the Tulkus. they would rather study with the Kempos, right? They would rather be there with, they would rather, put their faith in people who have worked really hard, not people who had everything handed to them. I mean, in some cases it's, it feels creepy, but in other cases, there are amazing lamas teaching today who are like the 4th or 5th or 10th of their incarnation line. So it's tricky.
Thank you, brilliant. It's a bit strange for us in the West. I studied with a teacher who died when I was in my 20s, so I just thought it was the bee's knees. It's a real stretch watching this little boy, who take his place. I just haven't really been able to do that well in my mind. Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, thank you everybody so much for attending, and thank you, Alex, for your wonderful talk, so rich, so informative. As I mentioned at the beginning, Alex is actually giving another talk for University of Columbia, was it? Or
Columbia and University of Toronto, yeah.
Right. And I put the Zoom link at the beginning of our chat if you're interested. And I think tomorrow's talk, you're going to focus on your website and how to navigate it. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's going to be basically a tour of the Treasury of Lives. So if you want some guidance using it, I think it's easy to use and pretty straightforward. But there's a lot there that a lot of people don't realize is there. So hopefully you can join.
Okay, thank you so much again. And
Yeah.
I just want to say this is part of a 4-part lecture series. And we're going to have Professor Charles Rambo on April 1st. He's one of the top Bonpo scholars in the world, I would say. So he'll give a fascinating talk about one specific Bonpo master. It's up on our website, the Shangshun website. And I invite you to visit the website again. Also, we do theoretical and practical. Tomorrow, there's also a meditation live course on about meditation for daily life, value of presence and awareness at 5 p.m. UK time. So please visit our website again for more details. I'm putting Alex's link to Zoom talk again. Okay, perfect. You did it as well. So that being said, thank you again, Alex. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight, joining us. And it's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks,
Sure,
Alex.
thank you.